This video is about the Rwandan genocide and how colonization impacted the events that occurred in the mid-1990s. To begin, tropical Africa had social development before colonization and achieved this at a relatively high level. The work of various social anthropologists through the years has focused primarily on tribes in Africa that have an earlier system of government and existence, dubbing them backward and underdeveloped, which has led to a vast system of misinformation so that many Western societies, when they think of Africa, think of those tribes, but do not account for the majority of Africans who were advancing rapidly even prior to colonization. Signs of development prior to colonization included the early transition to systematic land cultivation using stall manure and irrigation systems, the dyeing of fabric that many people across Africa perfected, the use of hoes to work the land, as well as the production of metal processing. Bronze and brass casting in West Africa was quite advanced and even better quality than their European counterparts of the same time. Cattle ownership was seen as a sign of wealth and power in many eastern regions. Slavery was also a common practice in many African states, often traded between East African groups and Arabia, although this account of slavery would later be exaggerated by European colonizers to justify their own immoral actions. State structures revolved around a leader, but the aristocracy often caused trouble in wanting more power for themselves, which led to the decline of many states. This practice of quarreling for more power is not unlike what was going on in Europe, despite the Europeans desperately wanting to characterize Africans as different and lesser than them. Feudal empires developed in Africa around the centers of trade that were established in cities. Looking at Rwanda-specific information prior to colonization, there was a shared language called Kinyarwanda, and there were three main groups that made up the population. The Hutu took up the majority of the population with around 85%. The Tutsi were about 14% of the population, and the Twa were less than 1% of the population. These categories are not fully racial or ethnic groups by their traditional definitions, and citizens could actually move between groups through economic gains and losses, marriage, and other things. Things were so fluid that if you owned cattle, you would be considered Tutsi, and if you didn't, you were Hutu. This constant intermingling caused it to be difficult to distinguish between Hutu and Tutsi. Looking at colonial Rwanda, the first European contact in Rwanda was at the end of the 19th century. The German government originally occupied the territory, but during World War I, Belgian forces defeated the Germans and took over the territory. It was the imposition of colonial policies that helped to define the boundaries between these groups more fully, with things like identification cards and a blatant favoring of Tutsis for their more European features. Europeans came up with all sorts of crazy justifications for their racism, even arguing that because of Tutsis having more European features, they were a completely separate people, migrating from the north to conquer the Hutu. This sort of misinformed education caused a great deal of problems within Africa, leading to a lot of racism and self-hatred within the African population. In terms of the identification cards, they relied on skull size and nose measurements to categorize Rwandans, once again reinforcing incredibly racist ideologies. Thanks to colonization, Tutsis made up the aristocracy. Most Tutsis were wealthy and occupied positions of power, such as village sub-chiefs, while Hutus were typically agricultural workers with far less power, despite being the majority of the population. Since the Europeans gave the primarily Tutsi sub-chiefs power, the Tutsis then felt obligated to carry out the European policies with things like various forms of taxation. Examples of these taxations included obligatory crops, corvée labor for local roads, and supplying workers for European projects. The power vested in the Tutsi sub-chiefs was abused, and the agricultural workers, who were mainly Hutus, became political pawns, having no power of their own. Rwanda did not gain independence until 1962. As a background to the genocide that occurred in the mid-1990s, in 1959, Hutus did gain power in a revolution, killing many Tutsis and forcing even larger numbers out to neighboring countries, specifically Uganda. The Hutus, after gaining basically all the political power in this revolution, did not dismantle the discriminatory systems in place from the colonial period, but rather kept them in place, merely flipping them for their own gain. The Hutu government kept the ethnic identification cards as a means of keeping Tutsis out of the military and government. People in those organizations also couldn't marry someone in a different ethnicity. President Habyarimana rose to power in 1973 thanks to a coup as part of the National Revolutionary Movement for Development Party, abbreviated to the MRND. His regime was tough on his opponents, and political assassinations were common. Many Rwandan citizens made their livelihood off agriculture, so Habyarimana said that Rwandan people could not accommodate a lot more people in the country because of land shortages. This reasoning was just an excuse to bar Tutsi refugees from re-entering. There were estimated to be as many as 600,000 Rwandan refugees abroad, many of whom were in neighboring Uganda. Tutsis became a target for the Habyarimana regime after the Rwandan Patriotic Front, abbreviated to the RPF, a group made up of Tutsi refugees in Uganda, attacked in 1990. The government used this as an excuse to paint all Tutsis as bad and extremists who supported the RPF. Rwanda militarized quickly after this initial attack, with grenades becoming available for a couple bucks to basically anyone. Western donors to Rwanda encouraged Habyarimana to start the process of political liberalization, wanting to promote a democracy. Habyarimana accommodated these requests while hypocritically allowing continuous violations against human rights to occur in his country, mainly targeting Tutsis. He even allocated resources to the war effort that could have been used to alleviate some of the country's main problems. Some of these problems included economic difficulties, which were worsening as a result of the war, widening gaps between the rich and the poor, concerning fluctuations in the prices of Rwanda's main exports, famine in the southern regions, and a devaluation of the currency that was mandated by the International Monetary Fund. Many critics of the Habyarimana government saw them as relying too much on Western powers, for example France, almost repeating history with the English versus French battle for sway in the region from the colonial period that had not yet faded from memory. On August 4, 1993, the Arusha Peace Accords were signed after significant pressure from external agencies, including the Western powers like the US and Belgium. They effectively ended the war between the RPF and the Rwandan army, talking of a power-sharing agreement in the Accords. This peace agreement was far from perfect, though, and there were many aspects that actually contributed to the polarization and eventual genocide that occurred in Rwanda 8 months after their signing. Some of the more notable problems include Habyarimana having to give up too much power, the armies merging, which meant the RPF troops took significant portions of the ranks and officer positions, and the Accords' need for Rwandan refugees to be granted leeway to return to Rwanda from wherever they may be living. As 1994 began, political assassinations were becoming more widespread, leading to increased tensions. Now on to the genocide itself. President Habyarimana was assassinated on April 6, 1994. The genocide that followed that night and in the following days and weeks consisted of meticulously planned attacks that were horribly devastating. The goal of the attacks were to eliminate moderate Hutus and all Tutsis because they were seen as opposition to the Habyarimana government. Somewhere between 500,000 and 1 million people, including children, died, though the exact figure will never be known. It is estimated that around 333 deaths occurred every hour. Though the deaths were horrific, a quick death would have been a mercy to the young girls and women who were raped and effectively used as sex slaves before their eventual death. While militias carried out a lot of attacks, platforms like the radio were used to spread hate speech, encouraging Rwandans to kill their neighbors and fellow citizens. Despite warnings of rising tensions and of militias gathering arms, the UN forces positioned in Rwanda did nothing, and even once fighting began, they saved the white people and then withdrew. Accounts from one member of the United Nations Assistance Mission in Rwanda, aka UNOMIR, which helped with the implementation of the Arusha Accords, recalls the lack of urgency displayed by his colleagues when trying to determine how best to help Rwandan citizens. Boutros Ghali, who was at the time the Secretary General of the UN, may not have acted maliciously, but his lack of decision was costly, once even saying he would get back to someone in 4 to 5 days. A plan of help was eventually revealed in late April, and though it had a lot of support, it was totally impractical, something the US called out, though that ended up painting them as bad guys in the media. In the early days of the Rwandan genocide, the UN Security Council, rejected using the term genocide to describe what occurred in Rwanda, because that would mean that the Genocide Convention Treaty would hold and the members of the UNSC might have to provide support. The Genocide Convention occurred in 1948 and ended with a treaty being signed that says the signatory states, including the US, the UK, Belgium, and Germany, must act when atrocities are committed to destroy a particular group. No international help ended up being given to Rwanda until late June. But an example of the abysmal aid provided to Rwanda comes from the United Kingdom's response of offering 50 Bedford trucks, which are early Cold War trucks, that subsequently broke down. The UNIMIR source recognized that by not taking action, the UN was trying to preserve their image after recent failures in Somalia and Bosnia. They were really not concerned with the fate of Rwandans. Basically, UN priorities took precedence over saving innocent human lives from slaughter. Criteria was developed as to whether or not UN aid should be provided, leading to increased amounts of indifference in the international community. Western media painted what was happening in Rwanda as another tribal war, another part of the diminishing of the severity of the situation on the world stage. In the aftermath of the genocide, women made up the majority of Rwandan society because their male counterparts were killed immediately. The women, dubbed the living dead, were raped and tortured, leading to thousands of births and abandoned children. As a result, a sexual assault committee was established with access to psychological services to help them recover. Ethnicity has since been removed from identity cards, and the killer radio stations used to promote violence against Tutsis were used for announcements after the war, trying to minimize ethnic differences. As of 2011, Rwanda has still not fully recovered. The wealth gap is still quite substantial, and there are certain similarities between the current President Kagame and former President Habyarimana. That being said, Rwanda has made significant strides, progressing economically, establishing social services, and having goals of achieving universal primary education and equality, as well as other positive changes. To aid in these endeavors, Britain plans on scaling up its support of Rwanda, hoping to contribute $535 million between 2011 and 2015. Western powers have already done enough damage to the continent of Africa, and even though they may not occupy the territory anymore, they must stop trying to democratize the countries, wishing to turn them into Western clones. Yes, many African countries, such as Rwanda, do need help, but that does not mean recolonization. It means support for internal processes and opposition to leaders who oppress their citizens and take away basic human rights.